Hi everybody, and welcome to today's webcast. Today we're going to be looking at some very simple selection file creation. So some of the more advanced options we won't be looking at, but next time we do it in 2 months' time, our webinar will cover some of the more advanced features that we're going to skip today. Now, before I actually launch into running the program, there's some overview things I need to let you know about selection files. Now the first one, and this is often one that confuses people, is the selection file itself is just a list of donor numbers. So it's a list of donor numbers of people that you want to do something with. Now that might be sending them a letter or an email. It may be you wish to archive them or delete them or make some changes to them or perhaps run a report on them. But at the end of the day, the selection file itself is just their donor numbers. So there's no names, no addresses, nothing like that. There is no indication as to what criteria was used to produce those, nor is there any indication as to which of the many programs that we have was used to create it. So once you've actually created that selection file, you need to then, if you're going to do a mail out, you need to then pad that out or create a file with all the names and addresses. And Gary will be showing you how to do that later on. There are lots of different programs that can be used to create selection files. I'm going to be looking today at the most general one, which essentially will run through all of your donors, looking for people that match the criteria that you ask for. However, throughout Donman, there are many other programs that you can use. So if you wanted to do a selection file based on, say, pledge information, maybe for doing reminder letters or something like that, then there is a suitable program within the pledge menu. Same thing if you're doing it based on volunteer information or any other associated information. What I'll be looking at today is called the appeal program, and it looks at basically anything that's on the donor record, and to a large extent we can also look at information about donations. Now when we run through this, and I'll swap to the program now, so in the Donman menu, from the start menu, I'm going to go to donor appeals. And then this very first one here, create donor selection file, is the very general program that we're going to be using, and we know that as the appeal program. So when we go through this, what's going to happen is we're going to have a look at a number of the different criteria that we can use. Each time you decide you want to specify a particular criteria, it's like a test. And in order for a donor to end up in our selection file, i.e. be selected, they must pass each and every test. So as it works its way through the donor file, as soon as it brings up a donor and as soon as it finds a test that they fail on, it basically says, no, you're out of here, and it will then look at the next donor. So by the time it's finished looking through all of your donors, you'll have a selection file of all the people that matched all of the criteria that you specified. Okay, so that's important to know. Obviously, the more criteria you specify, the fewer people you get, and I guess if you go overboard with your criteria, you may end up with nobody. Okay, let's go into that program now. So create donor selection file, and you get a little information message. We can just click on continue at this stage. So now that program has come up. You'll see across the top here we have a number of tabs, and what we've tried to do is we've tried to group criteria that are somewhat similar into the same tabs. So when we go to codes, we'll see a whole lot of criteria there that relate to codes that are on the donor record. Once you know where the criteria is that you want when you're running your selection file, you can just jump to that particular tab, set the criteria, jump to another tab, set other criteria as well. You don't have to work your way sequentially through. However, I will, to a large extent, work through sequentially. All right, now, looking at the very first question, it says, do you want to run several selections in one go? Now, that's more of an advanced topic, so we'll probably come across that next month. But the idea here is that you can set up a number of different criteria for different groups of people, and you can tell the system to run them automatically one after another and do it in such a way that if someone has already been selected in one file, they will not be selected in another file. So we're always going to say no, because we're just doing some very basic selections here. So now we need to give it a file name. Now, because the selection file itself does not contain any list of criteria nor which program, the only information that we have that gives it any meaning is going to be the file name. Now, the file name can be up to 30 characters long, and so I'll call this one some really great name like test1, or I'll do test2 because obviously I've already created a test1. The file on disk will actually be called, in this case, test2.apl, APL being short for appeal. But if you're doing this in Donman, you don't need to really know that it ends in .apl. If that file already exists, when I press enter, it will ask if I want to overwrite it. When I do press enter, it hasn't asked me, so that is actually a new file. It's now asking if I want to use a saved selection format. That's a set of saved criteria that's been created in the past. This, again, is something that we're going to look at our next webinar in a couple of months' time. So when I press enter on that, it skips over the Enter Format Name field. It also skips over where it says, instead of selecting from a donor file, select from selection file. Again, we're going to cover that in the advanced topics. Now, I'm going to press enter, but at this stage, I simply could have jumped to the particular tab that I wanted. So we're now on the dollar totals tab here, and this works in one of two slightly different ways depending on whether we specify a date range or not. For our simple or basic selection file, I'm not going to worry about dates, and we're going to cover that next time as well. So let's say you want people that have given you, over their lifetime of being a donor, at least, say, $100. So I can go from $100. If there was an upper limit, maybe you only want people from $100 to $1,000, then I could put $1,000 there as well. And then it will only look at people whose donation total is between $100 and $1,000. If I don't care what the upper limit is, I can just leave that blank. Now, I don't have to put anything in the number of donations, but let's say they must have given at least 2 donations, so it's not just the people that have given a one-off donation and that's it. And often you might find people that give to in memoriams give once and once only. So I'm going to say there must be at least 2 donations. Again, I can put an upper limit on that if I like, but I won't. So now, because I'm going to leave the dates blank, it will skip me straight down to the bottom, and all of the other questions in the middle it's going to ignore, because again that's for advance and they will only come into operation if we specify a date range. So by simply specifying the criteria up the top without a date range, it will simply look at what's already calculated on the donor record, and you can see that on the second donor screen where it's got donation total and donation count. It will look at that and compare it to what I've requested up the top, and if it matches, it will then continue with any other criteria that I'm going to be specifying. Otherwise, if it didn't match, if they hadn't given $100, that donor would be rejected straight away and it would then start looking at the next one. Okay, if you don't care about how much they've given, you just leave the screen completely blank and then it won't even look at their donation total at all. Okay, so by pressing enter here, I'm going now to the history and mail screen. So this is where we're trying to look at something to do with their history of donations or their mail history or their current mail codes and things like that. So up the top there, the very first question says donors must have last donation dates between. So this is very useful when you're trying to look for people based on when they last gave. For instance, you might only want your current donors, which might be, say, anyone that has given since the beginning of last year. Or you could specify that you wanted your lapsed donors, so that might be the 2 years prior to that. You can also use this for your non-donors. Now, it's not exactly intuitively obvious how to do that. If I want donors that have given at some stage up until, say, 2 years ago, if I go from blank to, say, the 31st of the 12th, 2014, then what this will do is we'll actually pick anybody who has given a donation but their last donation was on or before the 31st of December 2014, but because I've left the first date field blank, it will also pick up the non-donors. So if you only want people that have actually given at some stage, you would have to put in the date range here. Now, because I've already got the dollar totals here, then we also know that they must have given at some stage, so therefore it can't pick up the non-donors. If I had not specified anything on this page and went straight to history and mail and ran this from blank to December 2014, this will also include my non-donors. To eliminate that, I could say, yes, their first donation was from the 1st of the 1st, 1900, and obviously that will then only pick up people that have given at some stage, but prior to the beginning of 2014 or 15. If I want those people that have never given, what I can do is I can go from blank in here, and I can put in a really old date, and again I'm going to use 01/01/1900, but it doesn't have to be that date. Now clearly nobody has a donation prior to 1900, so all that it will actually do is pick up people who have a blank as their date of last, which are the people that have never actually given you a donation. So again, as I say, it's not exactly obvious, but it is one way of picking up those donors that have never given. So people in the donor file that have never actually made a donation. I'm actually going to use the 1st of the 1st, 2015 here. So this is going to pick up people that have given a donation in the last year and a little bit. Now that $100 on the previous screen is across the whole time, so they might have given you $5 a year for the last 20 years. So long as their last donation is in the last year and a half, they will still pass this test. Similarly, we can look at when they first donated. So if you're trying to look for your longer-term donors, you might put in a date range here, say from 2000 to 2010. So that means they're people that have, their first donation was sometime in that period of time, but if we've also got that their last donation is in the last year and a bit, then we're getting our longer-term donors who are still giving rather than those that have lapsed. Underneath that, we can look at how much their highest ever donation was or how much their last ever donation was. So those things are fairly simple, they're just dollar amounts. Next, we can actually select or exclude people based on campaigns or campaign groups that they've given to. So if we wanted people that are given, say, to a tax appeal, or maybe to our current tax appeal or whatever it is, I can simply say yes here. So I'm selecting by campaigns given to, and if I press enter, I can select up to 40 different campaigns that they must have given to. So we can do this either by selecting the campaigns themselves. Oops, I'm pressing the wrong button there. Let me accidentally go back to that. And so if I look at a drop-down list there, so I've got a list of my campaigns, and let's say they must have given to general, and they could have given to maybe one of our dinner campaigns. But if you didn't really care which dinner campaign it is, what I can do, rather than actually typing or entering each of those 3 or 4, I can just go dinner, asterisk, and what that does, when I press enter, you'll see down the bottom it says wildcard search, and so that means that if they've given to any dinner campaign, then that will be included as that. So I can put up to 20. Now, let me put another couple in there. So maybe bequest and fashion. Oops, didn't happen. Fashion. All right. Now, if I press enter on that, down the bottom it says must have given to between 1 and. Now, if I leave that blank, in order for them to pass this test, they must have given to just at least one of those campaigns. But if I want them to have given to at least 2 of those, I can say between 2 and blank, or I could even say between 2 and 3. Then if they've given to 2 or 3, that would be fine, but if they've given to none, 1 or 4, they would be excluded. But let me, I don't know what that came out as, so I'm leaving it as, sorry, what was that one? That was request or, no, sorry, I can't even remember what I put that one down as. No, that was general. So I'm not doing my typing a lot of good here. Okay, So instead of selecting by campaigns, if you've got your campaign set up nicely in groups, you might want to select by groups rather than by campaigns. The opposite is true with exclusions down below. So again, if I were to say yes to any of these, we could exclude people based on campaigns that they've given to. So if you didn't want people that had given to your latest campaign, because you're trying to do a follow-up letter, then you could exclude by the campaign or by the campaign groups. Okay, so this is allowing you to just select people based on what they've given to. Now, these next two questions will default to a yes. So the first one says, exclude donors with a mail code of no mail or no mail until after to date. So if you've marked somebody with a mail code of no mail, by default, if you leave that as a yes, you can't accidentally mail to those people. If, however, you are trying to perhaps come up with a list of people that you wanted to archive, a lot of the people that you wanted to archive would probably have a mail code of no mail, and that's why they're not giving, and so that's why you would want to archive them. So under those circumstances, if you're not doing a mail out or not trying to contact them, then you can change that question to a no. Also, if you're perhaps generating a selection file to run a report, and you wanted to include people on the file, even if they were marked as no mail, you would set that to no. The next one, if you've set a date of death on the donor record, these will also be excluded by default. But again, you can change that to a no if you wanted to archive them or just run some report that includes those people. Okay, now we're moving on to the mail type codes here. So we're looking at the mail code. Now, depending on how your mail or how you segment your data, your mail, you might be using your mail code. So again, we've got up to 40 choices here, and you can see I can select all mail, and I can select all mail who get the newsletter as well. Maybe if I'm doing a tax mail out, I might pick the tax time only, and I might also pick tax and Christmas, and it looks like there's another one there for tax and newsletter. And so you can pick the particular mail codes that you want. Anybody that doesn't have one of those mail codes will then be excluded. If you've got like maybe 10 different mail codes and you want all of them apart from one, rather than using the select by mail code, you would then use the opposite one, which is the exclude, and you would simply exclude the one that you didn't want. Remembering, of course, that no mail is automatically excluded up above. You can also use your mailing list codes, either in combination with the mail code, or maybe you only use the mail list code. That's up to you. Depends on how you set up your donors. But again, you can select up to 40 different mail list codes, and if they've got any of those, they'll be selected. But again, down the bottom, we can restrict and say they must have at least 2 of these, or they must have between 5 and 10 of these particular mail list options here. Okay, if you update your mail history when you do a mail out for a campaign, you can select or exclude your donors based on what their last mailed campaigns were, and each donor has up to 4 last mailed campaigns. So if you've just mailed out a group of 1,000 donors and you've updated their mail history to say, yes, we've mailed them for tax 16, and then you want to do another one, perhaps a follow-up to those people to see if they've paid, you could select based on the last campaign's mail to of tax 16, or perhaps if you wanted to try and add some extra people that you could mail to, you might exclude those that have already been mailed for tax 16 so that you don't mail to those people twice. Underneath that at the bottom here, we can select them based on how many mails they've received since they last donated, and you can also look at the number of mails. All right, now moving on, the next tab we're going to look at is codes. So on the donor record, we have quite a large number of different codes that you can set up. For instance, we've got the source code, donor type, extra codes, or auxiliary codes, and then we've got some other ones, like in this case, sport code is actually our user code. Then we've got user code 2, user code 3, and some of these other codes here. For these main ones, source code and donor type, extra codes, and auxiliary codes, you can actually either select by those or you can exclude. And if you type a yes to any of these, again, you get that option for choosing 40 different options. When we're doing extra codes, because each person can have up to 8 extra codes, when we do that, if we specify, say, 10 different extra codes down the bottom, we can specify a range of those. Whereas on these other ones, such as, say, donor type, we don't have that because each donor can only have one donor type. The remaining ones down here, these are probably the less important ones. Rather than having an option to exclude, you only have an option to select by that. So it's a little bit more limited, but not too bad. Okay, now the final screen I'm going to have a look at here is another. So up the top here, we can select people based on a range of the combination of their postcode and the pre-sort code. Now the pre-sort code is a mail center code. So each of the different mail centres, like here in Victoria, we've got one in Dandenong, one in Clayton, one in Melbourne, and probably some other regional ones like Ballarat and Bendigo and places like that. So when we do this range, we could say from 3,000 and some pre-sort code for that to 3,999 if we wanted to just get the Victorian ones, which are not with a mailbox. We can do exclusions as well with that. We probably should cover that a little bit more detail next time. We can select by particular postcode, so sometimes the area that you want to cover is not covered by a unique range of postcodes, but in here we could then go in, we could say yes, and we could nominate up to 40 particular postcodes. So if we were doing Melbourne, we could do 3,000, 3001, 3004, but South Melbourne, which is really close by, is actually 3205, so it's completely separate from it, but you could then nominate that in there as well. Okay, we can select by state because postcode ranges is not going to do it for Victoria because we, as well as having 3,000 to 3,999, we also have 8,000 to 8,999. Underneath, we can select by country code or exclude particular countries. The DPID simply says if you have the barcoding software, you can select people that have got a barcode or exclude those that with a barcode. Finally, at the bottom here, we can select by the donor number range. So if you wanted people that have been just recently acquired, maybe you've done an import and you added 100 new donors, they're going to have sequential donor numbers. So you could put in the first and the last of those donor numbers, and then it would only pick people in that range. Underneath, if you have people with birth dates on their donor records, then you can select based on their age. We can look at when they were acquired, when they were added to donor management. The RFM, or the profile code, we're going to leave till next month. Across the top, I'm going to skip the flags. I'm going to skip with code pool, and we can cover that the next time. So eventually we get to this selection finalized. Now, of course, if we're not going to bother with any of the options in here, I could have jumped straight to here anyway. Most of these I'm going to ignore for next time, but we do have the option of changing the order that these come out in. So by default, these are going to come out in the pre-sort code order, but often it's nice to get that in alphabetical order. Of course, depending on what we're doing, if we're going to put this into Excel, maybe from a merge file, which Gary will show you, then of course you can always resort that yourself anyway. Okay, so I've set up my criteria. Basically, I want people that have given at least $100 over their lifetime, at least 2 donations over their lifetime, and they must have given their most recent donation in the last year and, say, a quarter. So I'm okay to begin. So at this stage, as this is running, you'll be able to see along the way how many it's selected and how many it processed. Now, if you're a bit slow or if you've walked away when this is running, when you come back, this is what you're going to see on the screen. Now, essentially, what you're looking at, each of the screens, whether we went through them or not, it's going to give you a screen print of those. So once it's finished, you can then look and see, what did I do? So again, we can see here we called it Test 2. I said they must have given from $100 and above and at least 2 donations over their lifetime. So as I scroll down, here is now our third screen. So I said, yes, I want to select by campaigns given to, and I also wanted to, what else have I got here? Yes to that, and I selected by mail code. So when we get to the bottom of this report, we'll actually see which particular campaigns we've selected, which mail codes we've selected as well. The rest of this is fairly boring because we didn't actually go through it. So if I go to page 3, these are again those screens that we went through but didn't specify anything. Number 4 is the last one, so we can see that we did it in alphabetical order. We didn't do anything else there. So here, after that, you've got the campaigns we want to select by. So we can see we did general, anything starting with dinner, bequest and fashion, and they must have given to at least 2 of those. And then when we go to our last page, we can see the mail codes that we chose. And finally, we can see overall, we only selected 4 records, representing 0.04% of the files selected. So our total database here is 11,189. So we now have a selection file that has the 4 donor numbers in it. Now at this point I'm going to pass this over to Gary, and Gary's going to show you a very simple report that you can run to show who those people are, and probably more importantly how to create a mail merge data file and then import that into Excel.
Just need you to unmute yourself, Gary.
Okay, is that better?
Yes, we can hear you.
Sure is.
Okay. You can see me? Sorry. Okay. As Murray mentioned, when you do the criteria for your selection file, it can get fairly simple, or you can get very complex. And what we'll be looking at next week is not next week. The next webinar will be some of the more complex combinations of things that you can use. As Murray also mentioned, when you create the selection file, Donman does create nothing but a list of the donor IDs or the donor numbers that meet your criteria. So when you do the first step and go through create your donor selection file, if you open that file, it will be just donor numbers. So by itself, fairly useless. Okay. So what we're going to look at is a couple of things that we can then do with that selection file to say, well, now I want to actually see who the people are, or I want to create a mail merge file. So what we'll do first is create a mail merge file, which is the most common thing that we do from the selection file. So if from there I go down, I can then choose my list of donors, so whatever my selection file might have been. When you enter, the system by default will count how many records there are in your file. But if you've recently just created the selection file and you see that number comes up wrong, then you go, hang on, that's something wrong there. So you go back up to the top and say, no, I need to choose a different selection file, because eventually you may end up with quite a few files in here and they may not have names that are very clear. So when you create the selection file in the first place, give it a very clear name so you know exactly what group of people are in that list. So from there I'm then getting into options to say, okay, do I want to use the alternate salutation? So the alternate salutation is something that we've covered before when we've looked at the actual donor screen, and it's a field that we can say, yes, we want to use the alternate if it's there. In this case, I'm saying, no, I don't want to use that. I do have an option, though, to output an amount for each person based on their total in a period of time, which means depending on my criteria, if I was wanting to use the data to show how many donations and what sort of gift level the person had given to me given in that period of time, you could answer yes to that question and use the same dates here and the same campaigns that you did to do the actual selection. So if we did something like that and said from there, using the same date range for my selection, and I could choose the campaigner group as Murray had gone through before. The other option here is also I can choose only donations based on the ledger code. So in that date range, I could still choose the campaign and narrow it down again into ledger code. For this particular one, I'm going to say, no, I'm not worried about the campaign, because when I did the selection for this group of people, I didn't select by campaign. Use the second address file would only be if you're doing some sort of special mailing and you had second addresses set up for people, like if you're doing a membership only mail out where you might have had a record for Mr. and Mrs. on the donor screen, but you then had a second address record for just the member. So you can then utilize that. The next question down the output the easy debit code is something that there's only one organisation that's utilising at the moment, but it is built into Donman to allow us to do that. So I'm not going to cover that because that sort of goes into a whole different subject by itself and might take us a while to explain. Okay, so from there we then have formatted name and address with empty lines removed or separate fields. Okay. The difference between them is when you do the receipting, you'll have formatted fields which will be address 1 to 8, and any gaps in there, if there's no position or no company, any of those sort of details, as you go through and create the data, the system will then remove all those blanks, so everything's basically one field under the other. When you do separate fields, you basically do get all the fields. So you'll have title, first name, surname, position, company, street 1, street 2, street 3, etc. So really depending on the purpose of what you're going to do with the mailing, if you do need to be able to resort by, surname or suburb or postcode or any of those things, or you're sending the data to somebody else, do separate fields. If you're doing something that's, like a label merge or a standard letter merge yourself, then formatted fields will work fine. So append a check digit to the ID numbers. You get this option the same when you create some of the reports, etc. But what it does is create a check digit based on an algorithm, and normally the only time you'd use this is if you're doing something to do with BPay. Okay, so if you do it normally, you'll end up with two fields, one that says donor number and the other one that says donor number check digit. So if you happen to use the wrong field, it can be very confusing because the donor numbers, or what you think is the donor number won't line up with the actual donor. If you do the barcoding, then you can say yes, output the barcodes. And again, that was like one of the questions for the selection criteria that Murray went through. The one across from there, where it says do large barcode with donor number embedded, is a mechanism that's available that you can have, instead of the standard 37-digit barcode, you can have a 50-digit barcode, and embedded in that is the actual donor number. But the only way you can normally utilize that is if you had a barcode scanner or something like that, that when the mail came back, you could scan that and it would then pull out the donor number. So for most organizations, it'll be just output the barcodes, but no, I don't want to do the large barcodes. Output notes. If I'm doing a letter or something, I'd say no, notes are irrelevant. And the same, do I want to select the mailing list codes for output? Okay, so again, if I've just created my selection file based on mailing codes or mailing lists or any other criteria for the purposes of doing a letter, then I'd say no, I don't need to do that. When you enter next, the system by default will put this file name as appeal.txt. Normally a good idea is to copy the name of your selection file down so that your selection file and your data file with the TXT extension will be exactly the same. So if you're ever looking at them, you'll know that that was the selection with the APL extension, and this is the text file, which is the names and addresses and other fields that you've selected. If you've got a document already set up to use the data and everything like that, then down here, the same as like when you do receipting and things like that, you could say load word merge yes, and then go and choose your document. Most often that's not the case unless you're doing labels or something like that, because the label format won't change, the fields won't change, it's only the data that will change. Yeah, so then you could say yes and open up your label document and do the merge. When you enter again, you get to the next field, which in this case, because I said separate fields on the previous screen, is now showing me all the separate fields that are going to be extracted. Everything above the dotted line will come out no matter what you do. Okay, so it's just, they're the standard fields to do a mailing. Fields below that are things that we've selected to say, look, I want to add this to the actual criteria or the fields that come out at the end. The only one different would be the period total and the period count. So they are based on the questions that I answered on the previous screen where it said, do you want to output a donation total in a period of time for each donor? So I could do that. So this total here is not to be confused, if I go down the bottom here and choose donors, with fields like the donation total here. Okay, because the donation total is the donor's total of their, total money amount that they've given ever. Okay. So sometimes people will output fields expecting that what they're looking for is based on what they selected, but this one isn't that particular field. Okay, so it is based on what you said on the previous screen. But as you can see, in this list here, any of the fields that are part of the donor record, you can choose and export. So if you're using the flag fields for something special, you can say OK, and you can see down the bottom of my list now, I've now got flag 1 and flag 2 are coming out as part of that data. Once you add fields here, unless you, physically go through and say delete it down the bottom here, those fields will always come out as part of the data from there on. So if you've set up, fields that you want to have and use in the mergers, you don't have to add them every single time. The system will store that in a file to say these are extra fields that you've selected for your mail out. So once we do that, the system is now creating the text file. And if I go down the bottom here to open file, change that to text files. And now you can see I've got at the top here, because it's sorted by date modified, my current donors. Now if I open that, that will then be the data in its raw form. So it's just a fairly standard tab delimited format that I can use in Word or Excel or really anything I want to use the data with. One of the other things you can do, because in Donman, for most organizations, you'll have for everyone, you'll have a donor and you'll have an archive file. And for other organizations, you'll also have a prospect file. You can create selection files from the 3 different data files, but there will be different extensions for them. So if we were doing a selection from the prospect file, the file extension will be PPL, and from a archive, the extension will be XPL. Okay? So sometimes you'll look in the directory and say, oh, hang on, I've got files that are all called the same name, but the extension is actually different. And Donman will then look at the file extension and say, look, if you're trying to use a file that was based on archives, you won't be able to do it when you're doing the donors or the prospects. It'll filter those out and say, no, that's not what you're there. Okay. So one of the other things we can do for creating selection files is sometimes you'll have say we've got return mail. That's a good example. And if on your envelopes or the window of the letters, etc., you've got the donor numbers and said, look, the only thing I can tie these records together with is that they've all come in and I've got the letters here and I've got the donor numbers on there and I want to create a selection file and then do something with these records. In order to do that, you can go into the same menu, into type your own selection file. Okay, so give it a nice, if I can spell properly, okay. Return mail, April 16. And once I've put the name of the selection file in, based on the donor numbers that I've got on the envelopes, I can type in the donor number, the name will come up, just enter. Okay. So there's nothing else that ties these records together in this particular instance than they are all return mail. And I want to, either take them off the mailing list or do a list printout of them or do something with them, and this is the only way I can sort of tie them together very easily. So in this case, you just keep going until you've finished your list, and then when you escape, if I click on Open File again, so one of the options down here is Donor Selection Files, and you can now see I've got my selection file called Return Mail April 16 with the extension APL, and again, it's only got the donor numbers in. Okay, but I can then use that for anything else in Donman that I'd use the selection file for. Sometimes the criteria that we use to generate the selection file might just be to do a report to show how much people gave to certain campaigns in a date range. And this, again, would tie into what your criteria was in the first place. A very nice, easy way to get that sort of list of people where we don't necessarily need addresses and everything like that. We just need a list of people. Is this short summary of donor info. If you click on this one, it will then ask you the name of your selection file. Okay, so in this case, I've got current under $100. if I choose that, and then say, in this case, yes, I want to print a total for each of these people based on their total in a period of time. This will help me validate that I've got the right people. So especially if I'm doing segments based on, gift amounts, and I want to make sure that I've got the right criteria and the right people before I actually start doing the mail merge and doing all of that. So if I say yes there, just like previously when we're creating the merge file, the same sort of screen where I can say my date range. Okay, I can include or exclude groups and again ledger codes. For this one, I'm just putting in the date range. If I want to have a heading for the report, I can put that on there. But if I'm just doing a quick print preview for myself to just have a look and validate the donors, I wouldn't worry about that. I'm not worried about addresses. And then if you print, you have got print preview. So now on the report, I can see, based on my criteria that I did, was people who have given a gift from the 1st of the 1st 14 till today's date or yesterday's date. And now I'm validating that by looking at the report. So it's showing me in the date range that I selected, this person has given one gift and $80. So I can see all of these people. It doesn't matter if they've given me, 5 gifts or whatever. It's saying based on the dollar amount, they are all the right people that I had actually selected. So it's a very quick way to validate, if you have got the right people. The report will always show you over here the donation last and the date of last gift. So sometimes if you're trying to, do the selection based on lapsed donors based on the date of last gift or current donors based on the date of last gift, the same sort of thing. You can quickly run the report, just look at the dates and not have to worry about all the details over here, because if the dates are all in the range that you selected, then okay, there's a good chance I've got all the right people and I can now do my mail merge without having to, do anything, that's going to muck me up, or do mail merges and, start stuffing envelopes and things like that, only to find out that my criteria was flawed at the beginning and I've now got the wrong people, because that can waste a whole lot of time, of course. One other thing that will come up is when you do the selection file and you get to the very end of that process and the system has the print preview where Murray was showing you the criteria that you'd selected and everything like that, Donman by default will store all of that output. So if you said, I need to create a selection file based on the same sort of thing we did last year, because it's normally the sort of things that you're doing, not all the time, something you might do once a year or once every, 2 years or even more, that go, oh, how did I actually do that? If you either look in your Donman DM work directory, or again, click on the Open File button down the bottom here. If you see all the folders that you'll have in your, say in this case I'm in training, but normally you'd have it in your DM work folder, or if you've got multi-company or multi-department, the department that you're actually running from. But you'll see that there's a folder in there called Selection Report. Okay. If I change that to text files, so now you'll be able to see all of the criteria that was used to create your selection file. So where I've been doing the list now, the current under $100, if I open that up, so you can now see that it's got all of the criteria. So it'll show me every question I said yes and no to, people gave between $99.99, one or more gifts in the date range that I was also using to extract data. So if you do need to go back and look at any previous selection criteria and how it was done, the system does store those automatically, and you can go back and open them up at any time at all, and then you can print it out and say, okay, now I want to do the same sort of thing. If you have got selection criteria, based, say, on a mailing list or something that is very simple, one of the options you can also do is at the end of the process, the selection process, to save those as a selection format, which is like a query basically, that you can then run again. Okay? So we'll cover that a little bit more when we do the next webinar, which is more on advanced selections and things like that. But that's sort of how to create a simple sort of selection, or selection using simple sort of criteria. And then also you can create a merge file, and that file you can open in Excel or use with Word, or do the short summary of donor info. Yeah, so hopefully that's given everyone a bit of an insight into that area of Donman. So I'll hand back to Marla now, and we'll go through any questions that people may have.
Thanks, Gary. And just a reminder to everyone, if you do have any questions, you just need to open the control panel to the right of your screen, the little orange grab tab arrow. There's a question pane. You type your question in the box provided, and then we can read them out. So we'll just go back a bit. A question from Karen from Murray was when you were going through the details there and she just wanted to understand some situations where you might want a duplicated mail.
Okay, right. Well, that one was one we're going to leave till next month. But essentially, that question relating to the duplicated mail relates to the alternate salutation pop-up. Now, at the top there's a question, as Gary is showing you, include in non-duplicated mail. So this is very useful where perhaps you have a household of maybe there's 3 or 4 people in the one household, mum and dad plus 3 or 4 adult children, who are all on your database. Now, what you can do is if you're doing a mail out, say for a newsletter, it seems pointless and a waste of money to send 5 newsletters to the one household. So what you can do is you can pick one record, and that would typically be the parents. You can leave the first bit as a yes, and then in the alternate salutation you might put Dear Smith family, or in this case, Dear Hatter family, and the alternate name line could be the Hatter family. Then for all of the children and all the other people within that household, you would bring up the alternate salutation and you would change that first record or first question to a no. Then when you're generating your selection file, when you get to that last screen and it says, are you doing a duplicated mail? If you say no to that, it will automatically exclude anybody who has that first question on this screen as a no. So all of the children would be automatically excluded from the mail out. Now, obviously the parents still need to qualify with whatever other criteria you have, but by doing it that way, you then only generate one letter or one entry in the selection file, and that would be for the parents. And that's where, when Gary was showing you the Create Mail Merge data file, the first question about using the alternate salutation, you would need to say yes to that, so that instead of addressing the newsletter to mum and dad, it would address it to the whole family. So that way they don't think, well, they've wasted 5 newsletters when we only needed 1, why should we give to them? And so it saves you money and saves any hassles at their end with you sending multiple records or multiple newsletters. If you were doing a mail out where you actually wanted to address each one because you're actually asking them for money, then under those circumstances you would leave that as a yes. So most of the time you'll leave it as a yes. You would only change it to no if you've set up your households or same sort of thing with companies where you've set them up in the alternate salutation with yeses and no for the various different people within those households or organizations. So generally speaking, I would say that it's always going to be a yes, but under some circumstances, occasionally it would be a no.
Thanks, Murray. Another question has come through from Graham. He's just wondering, how do we select all donations, not just a total, to include on the annual receipt and merge them into the annual receipt letter?
Okay, annual receipt is something completely different. We did a webinar on this last year, and I believe we're going to put a link to that in our next newsletter. But the end-of-year receipt program only will pick up donations within a particular date range that do not have a receipt number against them. Now, I'm not quite sure of how this question is being meant. If you've got donations that need to be included on the end-of-year receipt that accidentally have been given a receipt number, but where the receipt was not given out, then you'd need to talk to us about how to clear out those receipt numbers. So I'm not quite sure if that's the way the question was leaning, but there is a webinar from last year on how to do end-of-year receipts.
Okay, we might be able to send that to Graham offline.
Yeah, and one of the fields on the export is list of donations. When you do the end-of-year export, You'll see down here there's a field that is listed donations, which has each donation listed. That'll have the amount and the date.
Okay, great. That looks to be all the questions for today, so we might wrap it up there. Thank you everybody for joining us today, and thank you Gary and Murray for today's webcast. As Gary and Murray both mentioned through today's webcast, we have another webcast on Tuesday the 21st of June at 2 o'clock, and it will be on advanced selection file creation. So the details for that are now on our website, and we'll be sure to email you a reminder as well, but you'll find it at donman.net.au and then under resources and live webcasts. And today's webcast has been recorded and will be posted shortly to our Donman tech support area, so you'll see details there shortly, and also a link in our next newsletter as well. So that concludes our webcast for today. Thank you for participating, and we look forward to you joining us next time. Thank you for now. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.